Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on a topic one of our listeners specifically asked about, autism and petit mal seizures.
Yeah,
Wow.
happy to dig into this one.
Yeah, it's a good
Yeah.
one. So, this might seem, I don't know, maybe a little specific at first,
Yeah,
but the insights here are surprisingly relevant, even if you don't have, direct experience with either condition.
yeah,
And, we couldn't do this without our expert.
absolutely.
So glad to have you here.
Glad to be here. And you're right, this is one of those connections that often kind of gets missed,
Go
but
ahead.
gets so important.
Yeah, so let's define some terms here. For those of us who hear petit mal seizures and are like, oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
But reminding again what those are exactly.
Yeah, so petit mal seizures, sometimes called absence seizures, are like, how do I put it? They're like tiny brain glitches,
Okay.
just for a few seconds. Someone kind of spaces out,
Gotcha.
maybe a blank stare, maybe some eye fluttering, things like that. They're totally unresponsive in those moments. But it's so brief, it's so easy to mistake it for, just daydreaming,
Right.
especially with kids.
Especially with kids. You just think, oh, they're off in their own little world.
Exactly.
And I was thinking about that, even as I was reading your notes for this, how often a parent or a teacher might just think a kid is not paying attention
Oh, absolutely.
when it could be something more.
All the time. That's exactly why we need to understand these seizures better, because unlike, the really dramatic convulsions you see with grand mal seizures,
Right.
petit mal seizures fly under the radar. And the thing is, research tells us that about 25–30% of autistic individuals develop some type of epilepsy,
Wow.
and that includes petit mal seizures.
Okay, hold on. 25 to 30%. So that's like for every 3 people you know on the spectrum,
Right.
one of them might have seizures.
Yeah, it's a lot more common than people realize.
That's a way bigger number than I think most people realize.
Yeah.
What's the connection there? Why is that link so prevalent?
That is the million-dollar question. It's complicated, right?
Right.
But think of it like puzzle pieces. There are multiple things that contribute to this overlap. One piece is genetics.
Okay.
Both autism and epilepsy, they both have genetic components. So some gene variations might make it more likely that someone has both conditions.
So you could inherit a predisposition for both.
Exactly. It's like having certain genes might increase your susceptibility to both.
Interesting. Okay, so that's one piece, genetics. What else?
So it's not just genes, right? Another piece of the puzzle is brain structure. We know that people with autism often have subtle differences in how their brains are wired, so to speak.
Okay, so their brains are literally, the physical structure is a little bit different.
In a way, yeah. And those differences, even small ones, can have an impact.
Makes sense, like how a circuit board, if it's wired a little differently, might be more susceptible to surges or, in this case, seizures.
You got it. And then we can't forget about other medical conditions. Some autistic individuals have other diagnoses, like intellectual disabilities, which on their own carry a higher risk of seizures.
So it's almost like these different factors stack on top of each other.
It can, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it makes that connection even more significant.
Wow. This is fascinating stuff. It kind of makes you think, if someone is autistic and having these seizures, what can be done? What does managing that even look like?
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like we're talking about navigating a maze here.
It can feel that way for sure. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Right.
But that's where individualized care is so important. And the good news is there are things we can do.
Right.
There are effective strategies to help manage seizures, even in the context of autism.
Okay, good. So what are some of those strategies? What can people do?
Well, medication is often a key part of the picture.
Okay.
Anti-seizure medications can be really effective, especially for petit mal seizures. Basically, they work by stabilizing those electrical impulses in the brain, the ones that cause seizures.
So they're kind of like hitting the brakes before things get out of control.
That's a great way to put it, but it's not as simple as just finding the right medication and calling it a day.
Right. It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. You need that regular monitoring by a neurologist.
Okay.
They can keep track of how often the seizures are happening, how intense they are,
Gotcha.
adjust the medication if needed, make sure the treatment plan is still the best fit.
So it's an ongoing process.
Absolutely. It has to be a conversation between the individual, their support system, and their medical team. And this is where it gets even more interesting. You might not immediately think of this for managing seizures, but behavioral therapy can be hugely beneficial.
Really? How so? I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that one. Because when I think therapy, I think, talking, working through things,
Yep.
not necessarily something physical like a seizure.
It's a common misconception. We're not talking about, sitting down and talking through the seizure itself.
Okay.
It's more about empowering the individual with knowledge,
Oh,
giving them coping mechanisms to use
I see.
so they can start to recognize their own triggers, maybe even some early warning signs,
Gotcha.
and develop their own ways of handling the impact those seizures have on their day-to-day life.
So it's about equipping them with the tools to navigate those challenges.
Exactly. And when you have that knowledge, you have power.
Right. Makes sense. And of course, safety precautions, those are always important.
Absolutely. Essential for any kind of seizure, but especially crucial with Petit mal.
Yeah, because they can be so brief.
Exactly. Someone might just lose awareness for a few seconds, and in those few seconds, we want to make sure they're in a safe environment.
Of course. Of course. So what kinds of precautions are we talking about here? Any examples come to mind?
Sure, avoiding things with a high fall risk during a seizure is a big one. So, like climbing on playground equipment, swimming unsupervised, things like that.
Makes sense.
Even something as simple as wearing a medical ID bracelet.
Oh, right, in case something happens.
Exactly. If there's an unexpected seizure, that bracelet speaks for them. It's all about minimizing harm, making sure help is available if and when it's needed.
So it's like creating all these layers of support, from the medication to the therapy to the environmental adjustments. And it really speaks to what you were saying earlier about how personalized this all needs to be.
100%. Every single person with autism is unique. Their experience with seizures is going to be unique as well. There's no one answer for everyone.
Right. And, hearing all this, it kind of sparks a question for me. We've been talking about how these seizures, they can be so subtle, so easy to miss, and how they might get mistaken for something else. It makes you wonder, how does that actually play out in the diagnostic process? Like if a parent or caregiver is seeing these brief episodes, what are the red flags? When do they know it's time to see a doctor?
Oh, that's such a good question. And it really comes down to awareness. I always say, if you see anything unusual in a child's behavior, especially these repeated episodes where they're unresponsive, staring spells, things like that, don't wait. Always better to err on the side of caution, talk to a healthcare professional.
So even if you're thinking, oh, it's probably nothing, they're just being a kid, it's still worth checking out.
Absolutely. Especially with seizures, early detection and diagnosis, that's key. The
Mhm.
sooner you know what you're dealing with, the sooner you can get the right support in place.
Makes sense. Makes sense. It's amazing to me how much ground we've covered. We talked about what petit mal seizures are, why they're so common in people with autism, and even how to manage them. It
Mhm.
really feels like we went beyond just, skimming the surface. We really took a deep dive.
I agree. And I think it just highlights how much there is to learn about autism. It's not a monolith. It presents so differently in everyone. Not every autistic person will have seizures, but understanding this connection, it's huge for everyone.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
about building that understanding so we can better support individuals, families, everyone navigating these challenges. And for our listener out there who specifically asked about this topic, we hope this was helpful for you.
We just scratched the surface, though. There's so much more to explore.
Right. Maybe this sparks some new questions for you. Like, how does epilepsy, beyond just petit mal, how does that present differently in people with autism? What about those behavioral therapies we talked about? What do those look like in practice? Whatever you're curious about, dive in. Keep learning. Keep asking those questions. And remember, you're not alone on this journey.
Beautifully said. And to everyone listening, if you have your own deep dive requests, don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you. We're always excited to tackle new topics and shed some light on the amazing connections that, help us understand the world a little bit better.
That's right. Keep those requests coming. Until next time, stay curious, everybody.